I have respect for a game that knows its audience, a game that finds its niche and decides to master that, favoring mastery in a lane over dipping into various trades. The main drawback to this approach in development is that you target a smaller audience. There is a ceiling on the amount of people that you'll appeal to, but if you pull it off, you'll manage to create a devoted and faithful fan base that comes back time and time again. Resident Evil 6 takes the opposite approach. It attempts to be a game for everyone, and in this way, it is a game for no one. It works to mesh every single piece of appealing content that the series has used thus far and mashes them into one giant amorphous blob. The result is a formless, ever-shifting, vague spirit, something that can't be quite defined. It's hard to nail down what makes this game so unappealing, but in all honesty, this game repelled me in almost every way. A physical rejection through the screen and the controller in my hands. The game pushes the action shift even further in this entry, following the path that Resident Evil 4 and 5 had carved out in previous games. But like two people making subtle jokes to each other by the water cooler, Resident Evil 6 barges in with a bazooka and erases all precision from the conversation. Its combat rides the line between fun and frustrating, a game that feels like it's actively stopping you from playing it at almost all times. You are stunned constantly, forced to wait seconds before resuming gameplay. Death animations are incredibly cumbersome, and overreaction and punishment for the player's failure. Where Resident Evil 4 treated the player to interesting, gory sequences, quick kills to showcase your own failure, the death was almost a reward. In Resident Evil 6, it feels like being chewed out by a principal for your failures. The combat takes the worst parts of Resident Evil 5 and doubles down on them. The story is poorly paced, with certain campaigns offering no information for hours, repeating cutscenes over and over again for almost no reason, only to info dump all of the story beats halfway through the campaign in one cutscene. New partner characters are treated like afterthoughts, blank pieces of drywall that only exist to be dragged along by our main character. Pre-existing characters are rewritten and either made incompetent or borderline disrespectful. The environments are cluttered and disorganized. Nearly every single area feels like a messy maze drawn on graph paper with a wandering hand, and then transposed into 3D without any revisions. Nearly no attempt is made to guide the player through this environment design, and instead the game relies on sloppy waypoints to push the player forward. And perhaps its worst problem, Resident Evil 6 far overstays its welcome. Just about every campaign lasted at least an hour too long. I often thought I was reaching the finale of a chapter when I realized that we were just entering a new sequence. The game drags on far too long, shoving its over-the-top action set pieces down your throat, whether you like it or not. When Resident Evil 6 does get its action right, it's fun, and it feels like I'm watching a pulpy flick in the theater. But these moments are few and far between, and they're often cut in on by 100 or more QTE segments that break up the flow of the action if you happen to miss one. Not to mention the gimmicky vehicle sections that are peppered throughout every campaign. Resident Evil 6 oscillates between zombie thriller, jumping from survival encampment to survival encampment, to gritty war drama, to chase survival movie. This game is all over the place. It never stays anywhere for long, so you never feel like you can connect with anything for long. Plot threads are left only to be revisited hours later and tied up, but by the time you get back to them, you don't really care. These are just some of the reasons that this game fails, an eagle-eyed view of this game's problems. But the issues with Resident Evil 6 sink into the threads. Fine pieces of dried, day-old food stuck within the fibers of the carpet. So that's what I'm going to be talking about today. I'll be diving deep into Resident Evil 6, talking about gameplay, mechanics, story, and every soiled carpet fiber in between. If you haven't seen my previous videos on the Resident Evil series, I would highly recommend checking them out to get the full context of the series development thus far. If you enjoyed the video, be sure to throw me a like and subscribe to the channel as it really helps me out. You can also head to the link in the description to check out my Patreon, where I've been exclusively reviewing the Resident Evil movies. They are arguably more torturous than this game was, so go take a peep at those videos. Spoilers ahead. Hey Dad, it's me, your favorite son, and today I'd like to talk about Resident Evil 6. Resident Evil 6 started pre-production in July of 2009. It took about 6 months of planning, getting feedback, and coming up with ideas to start full development on the game. Eiichiro Sasaki would be chosen as a director for this entry, continuing the trend of every mainline entry having a different director, aside from Shinji Mikami directing Resident Evil 1 and 4. Sasaki had directed both Outbreak games before he would work on Resident Evil 6, proving that he had already cut his teeth on the series. Hiroyuki Kobayashi served as producer on Resident Evil 6, and he had previously worked as a producer on Resident Evil 4. Jiro Taioka returned as lead game designer after serving that same role on Resident Evil 5. There was a ton of returning talent on this entry, previous Resident Evil series veterans and Capcom mainstays, but most of the communicated goals for the project were done through producer Kobayashi. In an interview with IGN, he stated that the two tentpoles for this entry were keeping the series' horror roots and providing the ultimate entertainment experience. We really want to balance all of those things out in this game in order to give a complete gameplay experience to fans of the series and those who may not have previously played an RE game. The team wasn't focusing on one specific title in the series for inspiration. They wanted to take the best things from all the titles to create something new. The ultimate goal with Resident Evil 6 was to create a new experience, and one of the largest development teams thus far was put toward that goal. 150 team members internally worked on the game, but including external sources, the team was somewhere around 600 people. The game was split into 4 different campaigns, and each campaign was meant to have its own separate appeal and design. Gameplay and combat were tweaked to head further in an action style without alienating the fans that enjoyed the horror tone of previous games. Resident Evil 4 started in that direction, and RE5 kept going in that direction, and I think that especially for the North American market, we need to keep going in that direction, and take that a step further. This decision was also made in consideration with the marketability of survival horror games. It was true that the survival horror genre was becoming more niche as the years went on. Shooters and action games were growing in popularity, especially with the success of the Call of Duty franchise, and this genre was more fertile ground for creating a massive hit. The lighting systems were also upgraded for Resident Evil 6 to create a more horrific and atmospheric environment. The game would see the return of many fan-favorite characters and the introduction of globe-trotting locations. But after a few years in development, Resident Evil 6 was released on October 2nd, 2012 in all regions except for Japan, which was released on October 4th, 2012 for the PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360. I played the PC version of the game for this review, which was released a few months later in 2013. Before we get into Resident Evil 6's story and campaigns, let's talk about its gameplay changes and mechanics. This game has mainly the same bones as Resident Evil 4 and 5. It features a third-person camera with a live inventory system, limited ammo and healing items, and a melee combat focus that helps us conserve bullets. The biggest change that Resident Evil 6 introduces is the ability to move while shooting. This was requested during development of Resident Evil 5, but the team developing that game decided not to include it. Because we can now move while shooting though, enemies naturally have to be more mobile as well to accommodate our upgraded ability to move. The monsters that we fight are more active, but in turn, we are more active to even things out. We're also given a greatly expanded ability to do melee attacks and movements. We can suplex monsters, we can crush their heads, we can punch them, we can kick them, we can running tackle and crush their skull on the ground. The melee combat was honestly a highlight of the game for me. Being able to do follow-up attacks and essentially turning the hand-to-hand portion of the game into a fighting extravaganza was something I really enjoyed. It made melee combat feel viable when we run out of weapons, but it also removes some of the horror in not having any ammunition. Because when we run out of bullets, there's no fear left. We know we can just kill enemies with our fists to get more ammunition. We can also roll, dive, slide on the ground when running. There's a lot to this system in general, but its complexity betrays it in the end. I know that defenders of this system will say that if you knew and mastered its complexity, then the system would show its promise. While I think this is true to a certain extent, I'll talk later about why that is an impractical prescription as a solution for the game. One of my biggest problems in the game is that most of its combat is taken up by fighting enemies that can shoot back at us. This game is split up into 4 campaigns, and each campaign will see us heading to multiple different locations. Each location usually has different enemies themed around the story and area that we're in. Traditional zombies behave like we know and expect them to, generally slow-moving beasts that wander towards us, hoping to feast on human flesh. But the J'avo are new monsters created from the C virus. They act quite a lot like the Las Plagas enemies from the previous games. They can often wield weapons and mutate into more powerful versions of themselves. This is a big gameplay change that Resident Evil 6 introduces. The fact that attacking enemies will cause them to mutate in different ways. Certain mutations will cause their torsos to turn into a giant exploding pod. Others will grow empowered limbs, legs, or arms, and others will see them developing a shield that protects their body. This is an interesting dynamic for combat and gameplay, but the problem comes from the fact that most enemies mutate in some form like this. This means that we're basically getting ready for every enemy to mutate. The random appearance of mutated ganados created anticipation and tension during combat. It introduced a certain amount of unpredictability to each scenario. These mutations here are more consistent, so each base form of enemy is just a formality, a first stage that we have to get past, not an enemy that we have to defeat. Top it off with the fact that we can't damage enemies during their mutation, and it creates a bad relationship with combat. Waiting for the mutations to be over slows down combat, and if we do shoot enemies too much in their mutation stage, we waste valuable ammunition. A lot of things in Resident Evil 6 slow down the pace of its own combat. Since there is a larger congregation of enemies that can shoot guns, we get shot pretty often. When we get shot for more than a few passing grazed bullets, we get stunned and knocked down. This can also happen if we get kicked or attacked in a certain way. We can get grabbed by enemies, causing us to have to complete a QTE, which also stuns us for a few seconds. This might not seem like a lot when it's isolated, but if you take damage or get stunned a few times in a row, then it really starts to add up. Overall, it just breaks up the flow of combat and the game in general. Resident Evil 6 wants to have this quick, flowing, high-action pace, but it just constantly pulls us out of this flow. This is furthered by the immense amount of gimmick vehicle sections that the game has. These appear most in Jake's chapter, often putting us in a car where we have to drive and hit certain jumps and objectives or avoid obstacles. Hitting anything or going in the wrong way is pretty easy to do. What should be a quick-flowing action chase sequence gets broken up by frustrating limitations that prevent this sequence from playing out. This is just a trend that Resident Evil 6 holds across its entire playtime. The game actively feels like it doesn't want you to play it, like it's set up to create this flow and then it just breaks that flow at every possible turn. This creates a frustrating relationship with the game and the player, where the game means for us to partake in these intense action sequences, but we're stopped by the very game that's asking us to do that. The game follows Resident Evil 5, though, in its co-op focus. We can play the entire game with 2 players, but we also have the option of playing the game solo. I am primarily reviewing the game from my perspective of playing the game by myself, but I did play through some of the game with a friend just to get the experience. Shout out to Evan Prince for helping me out. But much like Resident Evil 5, playing the game with another person doesn't remove the fundamental problems that the game has, and the AI in Resident Evil 6 is actually much better than previous games. I don't think this is because the AI is actually improved, but because you have less interaction with the AI. You don't need to provide your partner with ammunition. You don't really even need to heal them. Your partner can still die in sequences where you're supposed to protect them and in some of the vehicle sections, but I never had my partner die in general combat one time in my almost 20-hour playthrough. Something that this game does introduce that I thought was interesting is the new healing method. Our health is now represented by a bar rather than different colored heartbeat monitors. Each section of this bar can be filled up by one healing point. We can use healing points by combining herbs together as usual and placing them into our healing pack. We can then use each of these healing points to fill the bars even during combat. We can also use traditional healing sprays which fill the bar entirely. It's a decent system, and it gives us a better idea of exactly how much health we have at any point in the game. This obviously removes some of the horror from the game, but Resident Evil 6 is clearly trying to be an action game entirely. There are a few points during its runtime where it feels like it's trying to build some tension and atmosphere, but that is far more rare than the moments that it's trying to generate speed and intensity. There are many more problems with this game that mostly extend into specific examples of enemy design, environments, and story, but that means we need to talk about the narrative first. Resident Evil 6 is spread across 4 campaigns, each with its own main character, its own narrative, gameplay style, and tone. I would generally assume that most people play these campaigns in the order that they're provided. Leon first, then Chris, Jake, and Ada. That was the order that I played them in, and that's also the order that I'll be reviewing them in. Leon's campaign technically begins with a prologue that serves as a tutorial for the game. We are shown a broken city in flames, explosions around, gunshots firing everywhere. We're given a first-person perspective of Leon, who is trying to save an unknown woman from the chaos. This, of course, requires a ton of unnecessary QTEs that would put Heavy Rain to shame and sets the tone for our game. Leon and Helena successfully avoid the helicopter that's shooting at them and head into a nearby passageway. We eventually find a dead BSAA soldier in a nearby vehicle, and Agent Kennedy contacts Hunnigan, who's back in the Sentry. For a bit of backstory that the game doesn't really tell you outside of the optional files in the menus, in the past few years, Leon Kennedy became a high-ranking agent in the government. He specifically works directly for the president, Adam Benford. He works in the FOS, or Field Operations Support, as their chief field agent. This team's main goal is to oversee agencies working to fight bioterrorism. The game shows us how to heal through a short tutorial section, and as Leon consoles Helena, he is attacked by a nearby zombie. After dealing with this, Leon tells Hunnigan they're heading to the quad tower that has some surviving agents. Leon and Helena weave through the chaos of the streets and are eventually cut off by a crashing plane. We have to make an escape through the city and eventually board a helicopter with infected BSAA agents. We have to complete a ton more QTEs to try and maintain control of the plane while a BSAA agent attacks Helena. They eventually crash into a building and barely make it out alive before confronting a villain that they've fought before. This whole tutorial section is just a brief flash forward. The campaign then flashes back to the beginning of this whole outbreak on June 29th in Tall Oaks, USA. Leon and Helena are both in the Oval Office, and the president has turned into a zombie. For some reason, Leon hesitates as long as possible before killing him. You know, the guy that's been dealing with outbreaks and BOWs for 15 years at this point. The guy that was there during the original Raccoon City outbreak. I understand that the president is supposed to be a close friend of his, but it honestly just makes Leon feel incompetent rather than emotional. They eventually have to kill the president, and Helena reveals that she was involved in this somehow, culpable for the outbreak that they're seeing. She tells Leon that she'll tell him everything once they get to the cathedral in town. Hunnigan introduces Leon to Helena, our partner for this campaign, and an agent for the Secret Service. They tell her that the president is dead, and she tells them to get out of the city. Helena lies to Hunnigan and tells her that they have to head to the cathedral because Leon has a lead. This is the incredibly weak hook for the first half of Leon's campaign, and it is awful. There are very few narrative developments in the first few hours outside of Helena saying, "I'll tell you everything at the cathedral." There's no good reason for this, by the way. It's just a really cheap and generic way of generating a hook for the game. I can't tell you now. I can only tell you when we get there. It's just so that this game can generate a twist that isn't even consequential and involves characters that we don't meet until that very scene. This creates terrible pacing for Leon's narrative that makes it feel like nothing is happening for the first half of it, because nothing is happening for the first half of it. And Leon never questions this. He never says, hey, just fucking tell me whatever the big secret is now so we can get on with this. Outside of the office, we see that a banquet was about to take place that was interrupted by the current outbreak. We have an incredibly slow walking section here, weaving through balconies and tables. The game feels like it's trying to build tension, but it never really works. This also introduces the cluttered and near schizophrenic environment design that this game has. The environment looks good, there is ample detail present, and they feel genuine, but this opposes the ability for these environments to clearly telegraph what the player should naturally be going. In place of these, Resident Evil 6 introduces a waypoint system and an overlay that allows the player to see the direction they need to go, effectively removing the player from the environment and placing them in another one that does guide them through, but much more obviously. Good environment design should use funnels and guideposts to push the player in the right direction without pulling the player out of the world. Of course, games will sometimes give players waypoints as a backup in case a player gets lost and doesn't know where to go, but relying on this solely for navigation means that the player is removed from the environment. Their immersion is broken. Helena and Leon eventually find a member of the presidential party that seems to be coughing and infected, but he hasn't turned yet. He wants to find his daughter Liz that's somewhere nearby. This guy runs off and we have to follow him throughout the building. Leon wants to help him because he's a natural hero, a good guy. We eventually find his daughter in a room with a few other people who have already died. We guide them back to the elevator, but Liz turns and attacks her own father. We of course kill Liz and are eventually introduced to the hordes waiting us outside. A blaring car alarm is causing zombies to swarm the place. One pro that I will give Leon's campaign is that, at least for the first half of it, it's the most that it feels like a traditional Resident Evil game. Watching this outbreak happen and actually fighting zombies again does harken back to the original Raccoon City trilogy. The atmosphere that the game is trying to generate does work for this sequence, and just looking at this footage, it feels like the series returning to its roots. But it doesn't last long, and it also introduces one of the biggest problems with this game that I would say is mostly localized to Leon's playthrough. Most of the environments in this game are just way too dark. They're even dark when we have a flashlight on, which isn't able to be toggled, it's just situational and done for us. The brightness doesn't really affect this either. The game is just incredibly dark, and it's so bad at certain points that it prevents you from navigating through environments. In the next scene, Leon's good guy instincts are showcased even further because he wants to go save two men who are clearly already being attacked by zombies. Helena wakes him up though, telling him that they're already dead and it's futile. We eventually make it out of the building and into the nearby campus grounds proper. We have to escape by heading into another building and getting a key. We get fed into an alleyway, running away from zombies, and get into a car. A QTE sequence gets us control of the vehicle, but Leon manages to crash the car almost immediately, causing the two to head into the nearby sewers. Once again, Helena reiterates that she'll tell Leon everything once they get to the cathedral. We get a flashback to Leon's conversation with the president before he was infected. The president was planning on telling the world about what happened in Raccoon City. Apparently, the public doesn't know what really happened, and people were against the president coming out with this info. But he felt like this was the right decision, to start working with the world instead of for themselves. This obviously didn't work out in the end, but we jump back to the present where Leon and Helena are in the underground tunnels beneath the city. These lead into a railway system where we have to deal with zombies and dodge trains. This leads us to the train station, and Leon tries to save a woman here, but she is unfortunately killed by her own stupidity.
Wait, no! Don't open that! Oh God! Peter! Peter, hang on! I'm coming!
We end up weaving through the city streets and get to partake in one of the worst sections in this campaign. Leon and Helena happen upon an area with a few survivors making a last stand against the infected. We have to protect them and make sure they don't get killed. We then head into a nearby gun store and make another last stand defense against zombies in the first floor of this building, and then another one upstairs, and then another one on the roof. Most of the objectives in Leon's story fall into the category of defend until the game tells you that you're done. It's incredibly tedious and slows down the pace of the game, even though this should be intense action. It's also just repetitive and mostly revolves around a ton of characters that we literally just met and don't matter at all. This would be like if in Resident Evil 2 we spent 30 minutes at Kendo's gun shop and just killed zombies and then Kendo died. The other problem is that we're around an hour into Leon's campaign and we've already been to the government building, the campus, the city streets, the gun shop, and we'll go to many different areas throughout the rest of the story. But Resident Evil 6 has a problem of never letting a location sink in. We're never given time to get to know an area. This has the advantage of never allowing us to grow comfortable anywhere, but it also means that these environments are meaningless to us and just start to blur together. When I started writing the script for this video, I was reviewing the footage that I had recorded and realized I forgot large swaths of the game because most of it is just so forgettable. And it wasn't like I played it a week before I started writing, I finished it the day before. During the escape, we're introduced to big fat zombies, which are sort of the stronger, high defense zombie of this campaign. We get out of the area by getting into a bus, and Hunnigan contacts our partners again. She says that 90% of Tall Oaks has been infected, and some group called Neo Umbrella is claiming responsibility. Leon is getting deja vu because of the current events, which remind him too much of Raccoon City. Hunnigan tells Leon to get the info that's in the cathedral because some suits are breathing down her neck for information. She's specifically referring to a man named Derek C. Simmons, an aide to the now dead president. The bus then arrives into town and we are attacked once again. The two manage to escape the horrific crash, and Helena reiterates the only part of her character, Cathedral Woman.
We have to get to the cathedral.
Need to hurry.
Not before we check out Tall Oaks Cathedral. Come on, let's just get to the cathedral, and then I'll tell you everything.
We cut through a nearby cemetery to get there, but we have to get a key to get in, which causes us to backtrack all the way through the area again. This section introduces undead zombies that have crawled out from graves, decomposed corpses that shamble towards us. They also introduce the zombie dogs of this entry, mutated beasts that lunge and snap. This is another pretty dark area though, only lit by the lightning flashes in the sky. Once we finally get to the cathedral, we have to suffer another defense scenario at the doors of the building. We deal with some more difficult mutations here, in particular the Bloodshot, which is a more powerful and agile type of BOW. The Shrieker is also introduced here, a zombie that can call zombies in the area and make them more powerful and harder to stun. A lot of the zombies introduced in this game feel like they're pulled straight from Left 4 Dead. But both of these mutations complicate things because we have to target them before other zombies to ensure we don't end up in a hairy situation. It changes gameplay in a way that makes you focus on specific enemies rather than just the zombie that's closest to you. Once we actually enter the cathedral, we find a group of survivors holed up there. They are disappointed that Leon and Helena are not a rescue crew. Our goal is to get inside of the secret entrance in the altar here, but to do this, we have to solve a puzzle around the facility. It's a pretty simple one. We just need to collect some statues and place them on some daises around the area. I like the finale of this section though because we're given a new enemy to face off against as a sort of mini-boss. This is the Lepotitsa, a beautifully designed enemy covered in holes that emit a toxic gas that kills anyone who inhales it and turns them into an infected. This was how the outbreak in Tall Oaks began. This beast and its toxins have a 3-mile radius. Someone planted this thing here to cause an outbreak in this area, and it wreaks havoc on the cathedral, killing and turning all of the survivors in here. It's kind of a dark moment because only one of these things had to break in to completely destroy everything. Once we finally defeat it, we can get underground into some sort of lab or structure. As we get further in, Helena says that she remembers this place. She was here before, but for no reason, she still refuses to elaborate. 2 hours into the game, and the only information we've gotten is that we need to get to the cathedral, which is where we currently are. This plot is infuriating. Helena makes a run for it, looking for someone named Deborah, who will soon be revealed to be her sister. We eventually arrive at a lab. Grotesque test subjects are propped up on beds. We eventually find a room full of tubes and subjects inside. Leon comes across a VHS titled Happy Birthday Ada Wong. It's a video of something hatching from a strange carapace, a C-virus experiment. It turns out to be a woman that Leon knows, Ada Wong. Leon asks Helena if this is what she brought him here to see, but she denies it. She clearly doesn't know what any of this is.
Heading deeper into the lab, we find a shaft that gives way to a large underground mine. We pretty quickly find Deborah, who's unconscious in one of these rooms. She wakes up since her sister has arrived to save her, and suddenly Helena changes the fucking goalpost again. Now we have to get Deborah out of here before she'll tell us everything. We have an escape section down this massive chasm, while Helena carries Deborah on her back. Once we reach the bottom, it becomes clear that Deborah is infected. She turns into some sort of cocoon and rehatches from it, completely transformed into a new boss that we have to fight. She is impaled by Ada Wong, who is waiting in the wings. The game treats this as a really emotional moment, but this puts into focus how little we've learned about Helena and how little her character has been developed across Leon's campaign. She is originally introduced as a Secret Service agent by Hunnigan, and this is just about how much we learn about her in 2.5 hours. We learn that she has a sister named Deborah, and she is mutated, but that's about it. Helena feels like she's a blank partner that's just there to serve as a way to give this campaign co-op, but she doesn't really feel like an actual character. There will be more developments to her character as the story goes on, but most of it only happens in the second half of the campaign. So for the beginning portion of the game, she's just there. After Ada arrives, the cavern that we're in begins to collapse. Deborah then wakes up and we have our boss fight with her. She has tendrils on her back and we have to target the pods on them. Suddenly the roof begins to fall and we're separated from Helena and have to team up with Ada to get to the bottom of this structure. When we get to the bottom, we finish our boss fight with Helena. She isn't quite dead yet though, because we jump into a minecart and deal with a pretty similar section to Resident Evil 4, but it isn't really as complicated as that game because we have no enemies to really contend with in the cart. Deborah does show up again at the end of this track and we have to shoot her pods while moving. After the minecart crashes, she attacks Helena and we have to protect her, since she can't deal the finishing blow to her sister. This leads to an emotional sequence that doesn't really hit, where Helena has to let her sister fall down the cavern. Again, we aren't familiar with these characters, and we aren't close to them, so there's no weight to this scene. It's just a tropey standard copy and paste with nothing behind it. The lighting in this scene is pretty cool though. We do actually get some explanation after this. Helena has a flashback to being trapped in this underground lab by Simmons. Simmons had used her sister as a reason to convince Helena to work with her. She was told that the only way she could save her was to follow his orders. Simmons told her to give false orders to the Secret Service that would cause them to be away from the president for long enough for Simmons to release the infection and effectively kill the president. She admits this to Leon and Ada, finally letting them in on what's happening. Leon doesn't understand why Simmons would do this since he works for the government, but Ada tells them they're fighting against the people who really run this country from behind the scenes. And without elaborating, she leaves. Hunnigan then calls in and Leon tries to warn her about Simmons, but he's already there. He tells Leon and Helena that they are suspects in the president's death and mainly this attack. Helena accuses him of the attack, but he denies this as he works for the government. He would never do that. Simmons orders them to turn themselves in, but our new goal is to get out of here.
We find out that all of this land belongs to Simmons, even the catacombs that we're adventuring through right now. We have to travel through this area, avoiding a variety of traps and mechanisms designed to keep us out. Blades that we have to slide under, fire traps we have to use to defend our position, and splitting the party to open gates around the facility. Some of these sections are actually decently designed and play well off of the co-op structure that Resident Evil 5 introduced, but this section does start to drag on after a while. It just keeps going on for far too long, a problem that this campaign has in general. Once we reach the end, jumping over chasms and running away from boulders, we fall down a natural water slide. This sends us into an underwater section where we have to keep going up for air at certain points. Helena and Leon are eventually attacked by an underwater monster, the Burzak. A mutated fish whale thing almost attacks Helena, and Leon stabs it while it swims through the water. We run away from the BOW and eventually get chased down another slide, shooting a barrel of TNT to blast the creature in the face. We manage to defeat it, but arriving in the lake, Leon and Helena see an explosion off in the distance. Simmons is trying to destroy any evidence of the outbreak in the area, cleaning up all his crimes. Hunnigan calls in, telling the two that Simmons left and is heading to China. She sends them pictures of a bioterrorism attack there, using the same virus that was detected a few months ago in Eastern Europe, called the C virus. But our heroes are in a predicament. They need to stop Simmons and take him into custody, but they have no evidence. They are the main suspects for the outbreak, and Simmons controls the prosecutors, essentially. So Leon tells Hunnigan to fake their deaths so they can head to China. It's a stupid solution, which feels like Resident Evil levels of stupid, but more in an action movie style than the world-ending drama we got at the end of Resident Evil 5. Leon and Helena are on a plane headed to China, but their flight is immediately interrupted as the pilot has begun to transform into another Lepotitsa. Maybe if his co-pilot had the confidence to speak his mind, this wouldn't have happened. We have to guide the monster to the back of the plane and send it out the hatch, but every passenger has already been infected. Leon eventually takes control of the plane and lands it in a cargo area. When they land, the first crossover with another campaign happens. They meet Jake and Sherry, who will be the two main characters in Jake's campaign. But clearly we have no idea what's going on in their story, so it's just sort of random characters overlapping into ours for a moment. I think there is a good way to do multiple campaigns and point of view characters overlapping, but Resident Evil just sort of sloppily puts them together for no reason other than to make us think that this is some large interweaving tale with a massive scope. Sherry obviously already knows Leon because this is Sherry Birkin, the young girl that we rescued in Resident Evil 2. Since we last saw her, she became a member of the BSAA. Leon tells her that Simmons is behind all of this, but Jake and Sherry are on their way to meet him right now. Jake seems protective of Sherry for some reason, but a BOW shows up to break up the party. This is a monster that we'll become more familiar with when we talk about Jake's chapter, but it's basically this game's version of the Nemesis monster. We have a long battle where we have to attack it, but we can't really defeat it. We manage to stop it for now and are separated from Sherry and Jake. They're heading to the Kwun Lung building to meet with Simmons. We have to weave through the nearby city to try and get to this building and catch our culprit. Nearby in a market, we have to find 3 keys to unlock a door, but there's a new enemy here, the Rasklapanye. I'm probably not pronouncing that correctly. They're sort of like regenerators in that they can regenerate parts of their body when damaged. They can't actually be killed here. We can only destroy parts of their body that separate from them when they are hurt. This means we mostly have to avoid them running around this market to get keys. This is an incredibly annoying sequence as well because we will inevitably get tackled by these things and have to QTE fight out of it, getting stunned in the process. It's just so tedious and completely misunderstands the tension of the regenerator in Resident Evil 4. After we get through the market, Helena and Leon see Ada heading into a nearby warehouse. She puts us into some sort of Saw-type minigame where we shoot robots that explode if touched, so they bounce into another room where another group is doing the same thing. Once we get out of this trap, Leon and Helena cross paths with Chris and Perry, the stars of their own campaign we'll talk about next. Chris is searching for Ada and tries to kill her for some reason. Leon and Chris get into a fight over this. Leon tries to tell Chris that Ada didn't cause the outbreak, that Simmons did, but he won't listen. Leon and Chris are trauma comparing, but neither of them will let up.
I lost all my men because of her! And I lost over 70,000 people, including the president, because of Simmons.
He still vows to protect Ada, that he has feelings for her that he just can't let go. This stare down finally ends when Ada drops a flashbang and makes her escape. Leon and Chris part at this point, Chris vowing to take down Ada and Leon vowing to take down Simmons. Basically, nothing has changed and they're still both going to do what they were already going to do. We then leave the warehouse and find the meeting that Simmons is at. We interrupt it with Sherry and Jake arriving in the middle. Simmons turns on all 4 of them, ordering his soldiers to fire. Sherry gives Leon and Helena a drive with information that could stop the C virus. She was here to give it to Simmons, but Leon is taking it now. Simmons is then suddenly attacked by mystery assailants and injected with something. He jumps onto a train and we follow him. We see a call between Simmons and a mystery third party who claims to be behind Simmons' plans unraveling. She's transformed him to show him the monster that he always was. Simmons reveals that Ada was behind this, and also his own motivations. He didn't want the president revealing what happened with Raccoon City because he believes it would have ended the world. Simmons then mutates into his first monstrous form, a wolf-like beast that can run incredibly fast and charges right at us. We fight him across the train, and he eventually chases us on the track, shooting shards of bone from his appendages. I have to admit that a lot of the boss designs in this game are actually pretty great. The biggest bright point for the game in general are the enemy designs. Even the transformations of the basic enemies, the grotesque zombies, the J'avo, the bosses, they all look really good. I've already talked about how they don't work functionally, but they do work really well in an aesthetic way. I mean, what's cooler than shooting out shards of your own bones? We eventually confront Simmons on top of the train and we run him over with the vehicle. Leon and Helena jump off the train and land in the lake. This is the exact point where this campaign should have ended. As bad as it was so far, that honestly feels like a finale for this chapter, but unfortunately, it just keeps going. Leon and Helena get into the city, determining that this conflict is over, but Hunnigan contacts them to say that Jake and Sherry have been captured in an undersea oil field. They check the files and realize that the key to stopping the sea virus is Jake himself. Leon is patched through to Chris, but he warns Leon that a missile is heading into the city. It launches a toxic gas on the entire town that begins to turn everyone into infected. There's a pretty decent outbreak scene here that rivals even some of the earlier games. Leon tells Chris to go rescue Sherry and Jake, who it's revealed is Albert Wesker's son. Very random. Jake has antibodies for this new antivirus, so Chris and Perry head to get them. Before he leaves, though, he tells Leon that Ada Wong is dead. We weave through the city a bit and link up with some BSAA soldiers who take us through the town out of the toxic gas cloud. On the other side, a tanker explodes, and we see the sequence from the prologue where Leon and Helena are on the street, trying to escape the zombies in front of them. Ada was the one in the helicopter, and she was shooting at them. It's pretty weird because this scene in the campaign is nothing like it is in the prologue. We don't rescue Helena at all. She's totally fine in this version. I understand they probably did this so it wouldn't be as slow, but it doesn't really make sense for the continuity. It would be nitpicky if it was continuity between games, but this is literally breaking the continuity within the same game itself. They also didn't really need to make the sequence quicker. They could have just skipped it since we already saw all this. Regardless, the two characters make it to the tower and we see the villain they were facing, Simmons. Ada is watching over our battle in a helicopter. He accuses her of using Jake's blood to make the virus stronger. He then mutates into his second form, that of a giant T-Rex. Not sure how they got the T-Rex DNA, but okay. We essentially have to do damage to Simmons in his mutated form, targeting the eyes on his body, and we can do melee damage when he transforms back to his barely put together human form. I really like the design of Simmons, almost not held together by fragments of skin. We eventually defeat him once more and Ada flies off. Helena and Leon are taking an elevator to the top of the building, discussing his feelings for Ada, but they are destroyed by the still alive Simmons. We have to climb the elevator rope while Simmons chases us up. Ada is hurt in the battle, and Leon holds her while she recovers, even covering her body and taking some bone bullets for her. Not a sexual innuendo, by the way. This battle ends when Simmons gets Leon hanging off the edge of the building, and Ada manages to stab him in the side with a pipe. Ada left Leon a gift on the roof and heads off, ambiguous as ever.
What are you? Why are you helping us?
Wish I could stay longer, but I've got to run. I've left you a little parting gift on the roof. See you down the road, Leon.
Ada!
We head up to the roof with Helena, but Simmons is, once again, still alive. They do this final boss fight fake out way too many times in this game. It's not the first time they've done this in the series, making a final boss have multiple forms, but it happens with multiple bosses across separate campaigns, which leads to a lot of fatigue in the bosses and their associated characters over time. Also, when it happened in Resident Evil 2, it felt like it was basically a boss chasing us across the entire game. The same with Resident Evil 3. Here, it really just feels like similar boss fights all crammed into one at the end of the game. We fight Simmons for one final time in a big giant bug form on the roof. He's trying to grab zombies to consume more organic material and regenerate himself. The only way we can stop this is by stabbing zombies with lightning rods so that the storm targets him and does damage. He is finally actually killed once Leon and Helena take a helicopter out of the place and Simmons falls on a spike, his blood forming the umbrella logo in the square. Helena gets her revenge for her sister, and her incredibly thin story loop is closed. Leon and Helena head to the chopper where Ada left them evidence of Simmons' crimes. Hunnigan calls in to tell them that they found a way to defeat the virus, and Leon gets out of there, hoping that Ada was able to escape. The post-credits scene shows Helena and Leon visiting Deborah's grave. She's prepared to serve time for her crimes, but Leon reveals that a committee reviewed her case and she's fine. She's allowed to be an agent again, or whatever. The crazy thing about this is that if you read the files in the menu, Helena has already been suspended twice for crimes on the job. She used excessive force in the field, killing a suspect she wasn't supposed to, and then she shot her boyfriend's abuser, so they transferred her to the Secret Service because they didn't want to fire her. They transferred her to protecting the President of the United States because they didn't want to fire her. Also, after all of that, she was still allowed to be an agent. I'm not saying what she did was wrong. She killed a killer and she shot her sister's abuser, but why even note that she was in hot water in the files in the first place and then also allow her to get away with causing the outbreak in the first place? It's just very weird. This ends Leon's campaign, what I would probably consider to be the most sloppy and disorganized campaign in the game. It doesn't get much better from here, but it does at least get slightly better. Leon's story is one that is constantly bogged down by basically just nothing happening. A lot more happens in 1/3 of Resident Evil 5 than the entirety of this campaign, and Leon's is the longest one in the entire game. Helena's story and arc is barely present. It only really gets introduced about halfway through and then is left out to dry until the last few moments of the story. The other stories crossing over with ours really only make sense once we play those campaigns, which creates a problem of even introducing them in the first place. You could have easily cut 2 hours from this campaign and improved it significantly. Just to create some sort of clarity between all of the campaigns, I'll be rating each one based on the Resident Evil 6 rank that I would give it. Based on that scale, Leon's campaign gets a C rank. Chris's campaign opens in a bar somewhere in Eastern Europe. Chris is smoking cigarettes and drinking his fill, except Chris has become a straight-up asshole all of a sudden.
Fill her up.
You've had enough.
Listen, sweetheart. You're here to pour drinks and look pretty. So how about you shut your mouth?
A nearby young soldier tries to strike up a conversation, but he wants none of it. Chris gets into a scuffle and the kid saves him from himself. We learn pretty quickly that this kid is named Piers Nivens. He tells Chris that there's a bioterrorism attack in China and he's here to grab him so they can solve it. Chris went through some shit in Edonia some time ago, and he got post-traumatic amnesia from the situation. Now he's a drunkard in Eastern Europe and has no memory of what happened. We'll soon find out the details, but Piers is one of the surviving members of his team and can't stand to see Chris like this. Chris decides to stop running away and take on this mission. We jump to China, in a large metropolis currently being hit with a bioterrorism attack. We need to head to a point called 8 of Clubs and rescue some UN workers being held there. One thing that's different between each campaign is the tone and the style. Leon's campaign falls somewhere in between a traditional zombie outbreak story and a standard action movie. Chris's story, by that same token, is a standard war film. Chris is the broken hero, the soldier that's too hardened to fight again, but the only one that can do the job. But one of my favorite things about this game is how each character has a distinct UI design. These are separate with each campaign. Leon's is a square orientation, slightly leaned towards the screen to provide depth, light gray or white, almost like a see-through screen floating in the air. Chris is in an almost military style, colored light green and curved around the corner of the screen to almost look like a magazine. It's something that's very small, but makes each playthrough feel distinct and unique from each other, not just in play style and story tone, but in visual design as well. Chris and his soldiers head through the streets and are met with immediate chaos. We eventually encounter the endlessly mutating Javo on the streets, the new enemy for Chris's campaign. I already talked about these enemies and their downsides earlier, but we make our way into the building and have to fight through hordes of them to find the hostages. We eventually reach 2 mutated Javo who are holding them while crawling on the ground. We have to chase them through the building and kill them, rescuing the UN workers in the process. For some reason, Resident Evil 6 crashed a lot for me, and this section of the game was where that began. I just couldn't complete this section without the game crashing. I eventually figured out a way around it, but it happened in other chapters after this too, and you usually have to start from a pretty far back checkpoint when you crash like this. The building then starts to fall down around us. Most of the BSAA agents that were here succumb to the C virus. Seeing this leads Chris to remember what happened in Adonia, and the next chapter of his campaign becomes a flashback to those events 6 months ago, Christmas Eve 2012. During a civil war in the country, Chris and his team are mourning a lost soldier. He gives them a rousing speech that shows he knows how to lead this group. This chapter is where the campaign starts to get real war/battleground drama, and pretty quickly, this campaign straight up becomes a war movie. It looks absolutely nothing like any Resident Evil game we've played so far. The BSAA splits up into different teams and are immediately stopped in their Humvee caravan. This leads to a huge battle on the streets. Pretty quickly, though, we contend with a new boss, the Ogro Man. This enemy will appear at different points throughout the game, and it sort of exemplifies the tone that this game goes for. This is the El Gigante of Resident Evil 6, a massive shambling beast with great strength and size, a weak spot sticking out of its back. But it's about as subtle as a heart attack. It's an El Gigante that's melting wax from its face, covered in spores and claws. It doesn't really fit in with its surroundings. One of the greatest strengths of the original El Gigante's design. Resident Evil 6 as a whole takes everything that the previous action games have done and removes all of the subtlety from it. We can sort of defeat the monster here, but it just scrambles off into the city to destroy more of it. We make our way through more of the city, eventually finding a BSAA soldier named Finn on the bridge. Chris risks his life and the mission to save this soldier because no man gets left behind. They end up blowing the bridge and moving to a different objective. Piers and Chris meet up with Sherry and Jake, who were also in Adonia at this time. Chris knows who Sherry is because Claire told him about her after they met in Resident Evil 3. There's some friction between Jake and Chris immediately because he's a wanted target. This is interrupted pretty quickly though because BSAA agents are trying to land and anti-aircraft guns are preventing them from doing so. We have to take out these guns, but whoever the fuck we're fighting here is literally dropping in an Ogre Man into the city. This just feels so odd, and a lot of Chris's campaign just leaves you asking, what game is this? Are we sure this is Resident Evil? Because it actually feels like Gears of War or Call of Duty or something. This causes a massive boss fight, sort of defense scenario where we have to defend the soldiers, placing the explosives on the AA guns. Once we destroy the weapons, we can take down the final Ogre Man by jumping on his back and pulling out the plug so that the aircraft above can attack, which is honestly pretty cool, I'll admit. When Sherry and Jake are about to leave, Chris thinks he recognizes Jake, but he's clearly just seeing the Albert Wesker in him. Piers is upset that Chris let him get away. Since he is a mercenary that's wanted, he should be taken in. The team heads into a nearby building full of people infected by the C virus that have turned into cocoons. We're introduced to a new enemy here, one that hatches from the cocoons, covered in a hard shell that must be destroyed before we can do damage to them. After defeating them, Chris finds Ada Wong here. She says she was held hostage after working here and tells them about the C virus. She says that the organization supporting the guerrilla soldiers are called Neo Umbrella. Chris puts Finn in charge of keeping her safe, and the group heads deeper into the building. They are quickly attacked and rerouted to a different area. The entire team, except for Chris and Piers, are trapped in a room and injected with the C virus, transforming them into mutated beasts. Chris is unable to pull himself away from his comrades, and Piers is the only reason that he lives through it. This was all a flashback, though, and Chris comes into the present day, realizing his hatred for Ada Wong, and begins his quest for revenge. Now, I'm not going to say that Chris's story is entirely terrible. Leon's is definitely worse. Chris has the advantage of things actually happening to move the plot forward, and a side character in Piers that is actually something. He has motivations. He looks up to Chris. He respects his commander and can't stand to see him drunken and moping in a bar somewhere. Chris has motivation in revenge on Ada Wong and wants to see his comrades' lives avenged. The only problem with this is that it feels like it erases, or at least blatantly repeats, the themes that Resident Evil 5 already had. In Resident Evil 5, Chris was tortured by the supposed death of his partner, Jill. Part of the game was about him learning to save her, to overcome that, and to move on from that grief, to stop blaming himself for that and learn that the future is bright. This kind of defeats the purpose of that game. When we check back in and Chris is already going through the same exact thing, I'm not saying it's unreasonable to grieve over lost comrades, but it just feels a bit unnecessary when this theme was delivered in the last entry. Since Ada has been sighted in the city, our new goal is to track her down. We start to take out hordes of J'avo, and eventually we find Sherry and Jake gunned down by a group of the mutants. We have to protect them from above, protecting ourselves, and also the two soldiers down below. We face a chopper shortly after, and Piers wants to go after the two, but Chris is clearly on Ada and a BOW that's in a building close by. One of our soldiers gets pulled away by a giant snake, a boss that we'll fight soon. Chris heads off to save him and gets lectured by Piers for being so reckless. Chris puts him in his place pretty quickly, calling on Rank to shut him up.
What the hell were you thinking, pulling a kamikaze stunt like that?
These are my men. You follow my lead or I'll find someone who will.
Do you even hear yourself?
Fall in line, soldier.
Like I said, Chris is kind of a dickhead in this game. We then have to fight this boss, a camouflaged snake that honestly kind of feels like a more complex version of Yawn from Resident Evil 1. We have to watch out for waves and disturbances in our vision to shoot the snake before it lunges. We eventually defeat it by luring it into a generator room and unplugging nearby power sources to damage it. Shortly after this, we cross paths with Ada, who immediately injects a soldier in front of them. Piers tries to put him out of his misery, but Chris stops him. It hatches into a new enemy, a swarm of insects that will chase us unless we find the main body. Chris mourns the dead soldier, increasing his need for revenge against her even further. Piers tries to get him back in a normal place and tells him the truth. It doesn't work though, it only fuels his rage even more.
How many of our men are dead because of that bitch?
I'm right there with you, Captain. But your personal vendetta isn't gonna get us anywhere. If you hadn't been blinded by vengeance, we could have prevented some of those deaths.
Shut up.
Do you even care about our mission anymore?
Shut up!
I feel sorry for all the men that died believing in you. What happened to the legendary Chris Redfield, huh? What happened to you? It's a good thing Finn's not around to see you this way.
Piers is only staying around at this point to make sure that Chris doesn't do something bad. After this, we get chased by a helicopter through a harbor full of boats. We're hot on Ada's trail, though, and we end up in the warehouse with the saw trap again. We already saw this trap from Leon and Helena's perspective. Chris and Piers were in the room shooting robots onto the other side. I actually like this part of the crossover between campaigns. It was a cool little realization when I came to this part, and you can even see the other characters through the glass. On the other side, we see the same cutscene we saw in Leon's campaign, but from Chris's perspective this time. Now we know why Chris was going after Ada this whole time. We have to chase Ada down a highway in a pretty lame vehicle section. Most of the driving in this game is terrible, so when we actually have to do it, it really sucks. These sections are also needlessly long. They're far worse in Jake's campaign, but still annoying nonetheless. We chase Ada into a warehouse, but she gets away. We have to use a missile to get a way forward. We make our way through a massive battleship and eventually see Ada sending her message to Simmons, which we saw him receive in Leon's playthrough. She accuses Simmons and his family of shaping the world, but tomorrow that changes. We reach the helipad and confront Ada officially. She's being unusually cruel to Chris, making fun of his dead men. He tells her this isn't about vengeance, but justice. Ada has a plan, though, to recreate Raccoon City over the entire world. A helicopter then shows up and shoots Ada in the heart. She falls off the helicopter pad, but her plans are already in motion. They find one strain of what seems to be the C virus. Chris tries to warn the BSAA of what's about to happen. He and Piers get on a plane to stop the missiles spreading the virus from being launched onto the mainland. We have to escape the ship by completing a section very similar to the market section in Leon's campaign, where we have to gather 3 keys. We get an ace combat section, controlling a plane and attacking turrets on the battleship. This doesn't work though. The missile still launches, and we see the conversation on the other side that we saw in Leon's playthrough. The missile is then launched and the city turns into an infected zone. Chris and Piers are sent to rescue Sherry and Jake at the underwater base. Piers points out the irony in the fact that Wesker's son is the only one who can save the world, and he's about to be rescued by the man who killed his father. Chris tells Piers that he's ready to turn in his weapons after this. He can't be at war forever. He wants Piers to succeed him. After finding some records of Sherry and Jake, an alarm goes off and we have to get to the research bay. After defending an airlock and waiting for it to open, we find Sherry and Jake. Chris tells Jake after his first snarky remark that he can see Wesker in him, and that he was the one that killed him. Jake pulls a gun and pulls the trigger after getting some answers, but doesn't shoot Chris. The room they're in starts crumbling, and we have to escape on these small elevators that wind up the chamber. There's a massive cocoon here that's about to hatch. It, of course, does hatch and reveals the final boss of this campaign, the House. This is a giant enemy that can expel toxic gas and divide its body. Essentially, if it gets out, it will infect the entire world in a matter of days. We have to run from it at first, dodging its attacks and climbing high platforms. We then fight the beast in a big watery cavern, but get pushed into another chamber after the fight. It chases us once again, and Piers' right arm is absolutely demolished. He ends up injecting himself with the sample they found to give him enough strength to fight this thing off, effectively sacrificing himself in the process. This gives him a new appendage with the ability to shoot lightning. We then have a battle where we have to target the house's weak spot by attacking it while it's in cocoon form. If we don't, it will essentially just regenerate in the shell. After the fight, Piers is clearly infected. He tells Chris that he did this for the future. He wanted to be like Chris, to sacrifice himself for the world. Chris brings Piers with him to the escape pod, but it's clear he won't make it. Piers shoves Chris into the pod because he knows that Chris won't be able to face the truth, that he's going to lose another soldier. It's a pretty emotional scene, very reminiscent of Armageddon, funnily enough.
God damn it! Listen to me! We can still both get out of here! There's still time! What are you doing? No, Piers, don't! You can still make it out! God damn it, Piers!
Chris barely makes it out alive, stranded in the ocean with Piers' BSAA patch. We then see a scene of him sitting in that same bar, only this time he's eating a steak, just like Piers was during the introduction. No more booze for this soldier. A young recruit shows up to give Chris new orders, and he gladly accepts. Piers couldn't be the future of the BSAA, so Chris fights on for him. Chris's campaign actually isn't terrible, and it's probably the peak of the stories in Resident Evil 6. There is a character arc here, an interesting plot. It still drags on a bit longer than it needs to. The only one that has a good length is Jake's, but we'll get there next. Piers is an interesting character that has strong motivations and a good connection to our main character, Chris. The worst part about it is that it's mostly a repeat of the themes in Resident Evil 5 and kind of feels unnecessary outside of isolation. And another huge problem is that it doesn't feel like a Resident Evil game at all. It's literally a gritty war drama, not really a zombie outbreak or virus story. Overall, this one wasn't that offensive, and at least it had an interesting story that keeps you around, but it still fails in a lot of the same ways that Leon's campaign did outside of story. I give Chris's campaign a B rank. Jake's campaign begins with our new character in an undisclosed location in Edonia. Jake, as we already know, is the son of Albert Wesker. He doesn't know who his father is, though. He obviously wasn't present when he was a child. Jake ended up training with mercenaries when he was young and found a father in his mentor, but this man ended up being a double agent and betraying them. His mother was also sick when he was young, and he learned to only trust money. Now he's a mercenary for the guerrilla fighters in the Edonia conflict, and his only boss is cold, hard cash. He's learned to be distant from others and trust no one. So this campaign really starts back 6 months ago when Chris was fighting with the BSAA before he lost his soldiers. Sherry Birkin was sent to find Jake because he had antibodies against the C virus. Ada Wong is already hot on their trail when Sherry arrives, though, and Jake doesn't really care about saving the world. He's definitely a bit of an asshole as well, though, fitting the bad boy archetype. But Jake actually has something special about his gameplay. Instead of being equipped with a melee weapon like the other characters, Jake can use his fists as the attack tool that requires no ammunition. And it's actually pretty fun to use because it's basically an extension of the base melee system. We can do a striking palm attack and follow it up with even more attacks to turn it into a combo. It's incredibly useful when we're out of ammo, and it also makes Jake's playthrough feel way more unique than the others. His is completely set apart because it feels like he has something that no one else can do. It is a little finicky, just like Resident Evil 6 movement system in general, but it doesn't require some mastery to be able to even use. You basically just spam and hold buttons and beat dudes up. The first mission with Jake and Sherry see them trying to escape Edonia. Sherry wants to bring Jake in so they can develop a vaccine for the C virus, but he wants $50 million. That's Sherry's problem to figure out, though. But on their way out, they get attacked by the main villain of this campaign, Ustanak. Ustanak is basically the nemesis of this game, and in a lot of ways, this really feels like a retread of Resident Evil 3. Ustanak is an enemy that will constantly chase us throughout the story, but just a bit less freeform and a lot more linear. He has a pretty cool backstory that's only in the files. He was originally a very frail man that wanted the C virus so he could become more powerful. One of the memos even says, "I will no longer retain my humanity, but it is a paltry sacrifice in the light of the wonderful gains." And that's how I feel every time I pick up a weight. He took the C virus and became this monster we see in front of us, but he apparently still retains a lot of this human faculty, meaning he is completely aware. Most of our encounters with him are chase sequences where he hunts us down, crushing through rubble like it's nothing. We do fight him here pretty quickly, though, and find out he is near indestructible. He can't even be downed no matter how many magnum bullets we pump into him. Pretty early into the campaign, though, we also encounter Chris, seeing the other side of this cutscene and scenario from Jake's perspective. We also have to do this scenario again, which is really cumbersome. There's a lot of repeat stuff in Jake's scenario, mainly because we've already played 2 of these campaigns so far, and Chris and his greatly overlap. Ada's will probably be the worst in that regard because she overlaps with just about everyone, but this whole sequence is basically just like it was in Chris's. Just take out the AA guns and fight the Ogre Man. After we split from the BSAA team and leave Chris to develop his post-traumatic amnesia, Jake and Sherry take a helicopter out of this place. Sherry is trying to get the government to pay for Jake's $50 million bill, but they are attacked by the Ustanak. We have to fend him off in one vehicle and jump to another before fighting him off with a mounted gun as he hangs from copters. The plane starts to go down, but luckily they parachute into the snow. Sherry is impaled and Jake pulls the steel out of her back and she regenerates. Sherry has changed quite a bit since we saw her last. She actually has regenerative powers since she was injected with the G virus. She was tested on and prodded by the government for years. Claire was there to provide moral support, but she was eventually taken legally by Derek Simmons. He became her guardian and the government was keeping her to test on her, but also to protect her from Albert Wesker. Once Wesker died, she was offered a job as a high-ranking agent with the US government. But since she has regenerative powers, this steel in her back is nothing. Sherry grabs her phone from the wreckage, but the data on it is gone. Everything on Jake and his blood and his analysis has been wiped. Jake is upset as well, because he won't get his $50 million. Our goal is to get out of this place by finding 3 keys, just like in every single other campaign that we've played so far, but this section is one of the worst ones in the entire game. We have to wander through this snowy mountain with barely any visibility at all. The whole map is huge and is connected in the most incomprehensible way. You can barely navigate around this place and try to find these keys because you can't see. There's a part with an ice lake and we have to drive across it with a snowmobile. It's just really bad. We eventually have to backtrack all the way through just to get to the place that we need to put the keys. The two eventually get to a cabin, a place to camp out for a bit. Sherry eventually decides to get help, but the storm is too strong. The tension between the two is palpable, though. Sherry reveals some of her past about how she was infected originally and what happened to her dad in Resident Evil 2. She talks about Leon and Claire as well, and how they are the people she's the closest to. They are eventually attacked, and in classic rom-com fashion, Jake has to tackle her to the ground. We defeat these guys and have to ride a snowmobile down the hill. This is also a terrible section because it's incredibly difficult to control the vehicles. The slightest movement to the right or left sends us careening off the side. This sequence is also just visually fucked up because you can barely tell what's going on. Where are we? Is the mountain collapsing? Are we inside of an iceberg? Are we underground? Who knows? When we get to the bottom, we find Ustanak again, but we can't fight him. We have to sneak around. We have to distract him with explosives so that Sherry can get a key out of this place. He also has these small insects called Oko that are released from the Ustanak's organs. They can sense when we're nearby and alert him. We can stealth take them out and carve a path out of the facility. We eventually corner him with a digging machine that requires far too many QTEs to complete. It impales him and seems like he's entirely dead, but of course, we know he comes back later. When we get outside, we find the rendezvous for Sherry, but Ustanak is still not dead and murks both of our heroes. Ada Wong shows up and tells Jake about his father, Wesker. She ends up taking him into custody shortly after. Jake and Sherry are captured for 6 months before our story picks up again. One day, Jake is retrieved from his cell, and for some reason it took him 6 months to decide he didn't want to be locked up in captivity anymore, so he breaks out. This is where we have to use Jake's hand-to-hand combat because we have no weapons yet. We have to escape this facility with Sherry, taking out a ton of J'avo guards and eventually protecting her with turrets on the walls. When we reconnect with our partner, the two get dressed and retrieve their weapons. Sherry asks Jake about Wesker, his father, but she pretends she didn't know anything about him.
I guess he had an antibody that could fight off any virus. Apparently, he abused his gift, took it for granted, and then ended up turning himself into some kind of monster. You know, I thought dear old dad was just a deadbeat who skipped out on us. No, he was actually a freaking nut job who almost destroyed the world.
Your father's actions have nothing to do with you.
Yeah, but his blood does.
Jake's journey is really about learning that he's more than his lineage, that he can make his own path and take responsibility for his life. We have to get out of this facility and reconnect with Sherry's superiors. To get out, though, we have to collect 10 ID chips across the building. This requires killing different enemies and collecting the chips from puzzles in the environment. It's a pretty cumbersome section because it takes up so much time, but once we do complete it, Sherry finds the data chip on Jake. She calls Simmons and reports that they're in China. Simmons is already here, so we need to meet up with them. On our way out, we are attacked by a tank and have to escape. We luckily get a motorcycle and can speed away from our pursuers, but this once again amplifies just how bad the driving in the game is. The bike is incredibly hard to control, sweeping across the entire width of the street. We eventually contend with a helicopter and crash into the city. We're then overseen by Chris and Piers, seeing the other side of another sequence from Chris's campaign. After Chris and Piers save us, we make our way through the city and contend with another new enemy. A C-virus mutation that is basically the Chainsaw Man from previous entries, but once again removing all subtlety and design from the original monster to create something that functions exactly the same, just amped up to 1,000. After defeating it, we meet up with Leon and Helena, repeating the same sequence over again from Jake and Sherry's perspective. Jake and Sherry eventually make it to the harbor and are chased by the Chainsaw Man. Someone is overlooking them though because they're protected by a sniper. When they show up to the meeting point with Simmons, which we've already seen from Leon's side, things go wrong. Sherry gives Leon the data on Jake's blood and the two try to escape but are cornered by Jaavo. Jake has the opportunity to run but decides not to, realizing that he's finally learned to care about someone, Sherry Birkin. The two are kidnapped anyways and taken to the underwater facility. Sherry apologizes for trusting Simmons in the first place. They are quickly released from their bindings though, as Chris and Piers have arrived at the facility. We have to escape this place in a wild section, following this malfunctioning elevator up and down a chasm to try and get to different switches that open doors. Once we get out, we see this cutscene from Jake's perspective and have to do another recycled section, shooting enemies as we move up an elevator. Finally, once we get to the top, Chris and Piers head off to fight House, and Jake says that he isn't Wesker, and he's going to make sure he never becomes him. He's choosing his own life now, his own path. We then have a final fight with Ustanok on narrow pathways and eventually on a cracking lava arena. Pushing him into the lava isn't quite enough though because he chases us on a jet-propelled elevator. We have to crawl away from him in the longest QTE sequence ever, and eventually we shoot him with one final bullet. The flame and lava seem to have exposed his heart, and this actually does kill him. Jake thanks Sherry for saving him, and the two clearly have something between them, romantic or platonic. Jake has learned to care. We then see Sherry in a plane. The UN has been testing Jake's samples for the past 6 months. A vaccine has been created at this point, and things are calming down. The world was saved. Jake sends Sherry a text that he has lowered his asking price to $50. Jake has entirely left his trust and care for money. He's a different man now, and won't be like his father before him. But we see Jake on a motorcycle wearing Wesker-style glasses, showing that he still, at least, has his dad's swag. I really don't mind the story in Jake's playthrough at all. I think it's pretty decent, and Jake was one of the only new main characters introduced that I liked. He's obviously a bit tropey, but it feels like it fits with the tale. He's distanced and doesn't hold a lot of trust for anyone. He only trusts that cold, hard Scratch. But throughout his journeys with Sherry, he learns to trust someone else, to care about someone else. But also deeper in the themes for this campaign is the fact that Jake is trying to break the cycle of his father's crimes. He doesn't want to be like his dad. He wants to make his own way, and he eventually learns to do this, to become the hero that his father could never be. But the biggest part of where Jake's campaign fails is in just how stale the whole thing is. There are way too many chase/vehicle sections to really make this thing fun. While this should keep the pace moving, the strict nature of these sections really just slows the whole thing down. Instead of feeling like a constant chase, it really just feels like chunks of a chase that we have to complete as different levels. Also, a lot of the non-chase sequences are just rehashed from previous campaigns, since this one has so much overlap with the others. It leaves a lot of the campaign feeling like we've already done it before, because we have. Because of this, Jake's campaign gets a B rank. Ada's campaign is the final one in the story, and it mostly exists to wrap up and explain all of the loose threads in the story. Ever wonder why the hell Ada was tweaking out and killing everyone? Well, that'll get explained here, and it's even stupider than you could imagine. We obviously play Ada during this section, and if we're playing solo, then it's just Ada, as this was really the only one that was built as a solo campaign. We can also play co-op though if we want, and our partner is basically Hunk, but the game doesn't call him Hunk for some reason. This co-op feature for this campaign was only added after Resident Evil 6 was released because fans complained. Regardless, Ada's campaign begins as she's infiltrating a submarine. We see a flashback to Ada in a mansion as she's being chased by soldiers. She has a futuristic video call with Simmons. He gives Ada a piece of intel that interests her, which leads her to the submarine. She's here to investigate Simmons, mainly because they worked together in the past, and once she realized Simmons was up to shady shit, she abandoned him, so now he has it out for her. Ada's biggest gameplay change is that her main weapon is the crossbow that she uses in previous games. It's not a very good weapon in Resident Evil 6 and honestly kind of sucks, but Ada is proficient in hand-to-hand combat, so that makes up for it a bit. And if the previous gameplay chapters were action movies, like a standard zombie flick, an intense war drama, and a globe-trotting chase film, then this campaign is the most standard Resident Evil game out of all four. In Ada's campaign, we actually get to solve puzzles. It feels the most like a previous entry in the series, even though it has its fair share of action moments and tone. But Ada has some seriously poorly implemented stealth sections that, if failed, result in us fighting swarms of unnecessary enemies. But the story is easily the worst part of the campaign, and drags it down by a mile. Aboard the submarine, we find a presentation that gives orders to Ada to find Sherry and Jake and see if he has the C virus. But this was from 6 months ago, and Ada doesn't remember these orders. As she escapes the destroyed submarine, she speaks to Simmons, who spells it out plainly for her. The US is about to be hit by a bioterrorism attack, and then China will be hit. This will all be done by the leader of Neo Umbrella, Ada Wong. Ada still doesn't understand, but she doesn't want to be complicit. She escapes the submarine and arrives in Tall Oaks the next day. She arrives after the attack and tries to get access to Simmons' lab in the catacombs. We have to solve some puzzles here and gather some crests. There's actually a pretty cool puzzle here that requires us to remove weight off of a floor that falls when too much is on it. The only way to solve this is to impale the zombies on the floor into the wall. It was a pretty unique puzzle that actually stumped me for a few minutes. Eventually, Ada finds the bottom of this chasm and sees Helena's sister about to transform. We then get the same sequence from before, but as Ada. We have the same boss fight and minecart section as before, and Deborah ends up dead. After she leaves these two, Simmons tells her to head to the research lab. She ends up seeing the VHS tape that Leon saw before of herself being birthed from a shell. But it's clear now, from Ada's perspective, that this wasn't the real Ada. Simmons created some sort of clone, not only to besmirch Ada's name, but to also create a leader of Neo Umbrella. Now that Ada realizes what's going on, she needs to take down this imposter Ada Wong. We then jump over to China as Chris's team is heading in to rescue hostages. Ada heads through the market streets of China and deals with the chainsaw man that Jake and Sherry dealt with. She eventually locates these two running away from that same enemy after she gets rid of it and helps them out. We then have to oversee them with a sniper rifle. Ada then heads on to the battleship and finds records of the experiments that Simmons was conducting to recreate Ada Wong. Ada then sees her clone falling from the helicopter pad after being shot by a sniper. Ada sort of reveals the backstory here, one that's mostly elaborated upon, again, in the files in the main menu. Derek Simmons had a researcher named Carla. This woman was the one who discovered the C virus. She was highly devoted to Simmons, and he eventually tricked her into getting into an experiment to become Ada Wong's clone. It worked, but some of her original humanity remained, and she had a huge vendetta against Simmons for what he did to her. Simmons originally wanted to recreate Ada Wong because she stopped working for him, and the files leave it a bit ambiguous, but my read is that he was in love with her and was sick of getting cucked by Leon, so he made his own Ada Wong. Ada talks to Carla's dead body, but she eventually transforms. She wasn't really dead. She starts merging with the battleship beneath her. We then have to defeat these mimics and forms of her body as we move through the halls of the battleship. Ada eventually jumps in a helicopter and arrives in the city to save Leon and Helena, once again giving us another perspective of this scenario. This eventually progresses into her helping their final battle with Simmons and forcing us to redo these fights again, adding almost nothing new in the process. The only thing we really see new is that Ada was overlooking Leon when he read her message. We then get a final scene with Ada as she walks through a facility, and we have the final objective: tie up loose ends. We're in Carla's lab and we see the scene of Simmons tricking her into becoming the new Ada Wong. In the last chamber, we find a test subject. It's being birthed, but Ada kills it before it can properly hatch. She destroys all of her research material and gets a call for a new job from a mystery person. We then see one final post-credits scene as a man appears in the shadows, making a deal with a child. He is given an apple and heads out into the town. Tons of BOWs swarm on his location as he reveals his identity: Jake Mueller. He keeps his promise to kill the BOWs for the paltry sum of an apple. If I'm being totally honest, Ada's campaign is easily the worst one in the entire game. While I complained about the length of the other campaigns, most of that was due to pacing, not due purely to length. Ada's is short, and it's probably too short and mostly unnecessary. Most of the reveals in this campaign are cheap and don't make a lot of sense. It's a massive cop-out that Ada wasn't actually turned into a villain, which wouldn't make sense for her character anyways. It was just that it was her clone the whole time. But the clone wasn't actually a clone, it was still the original researcher. Sort of, but not really. And the whole reason that this entire thing happened was because Derek Simmons was in love with Ada Wong and needed to create a new version of her since he pissed the real version off. The narrative in Ada's campaign is the worst because it makes the story from the entire game worse. It's not isolated to just this one. For that, I give Ada's campaign a D rank. There's one last thing to talk about before I give my final thoughts on this game, because there were no narrative DLC released for Resident Evil 6. There were PvP modes released, but nothing of real substance. Resident Evil 6 does have a Mercenaries mode, and it is substantial, but it honestly fails in much of the same ways that the main game does. It just suffers from all the movement system issues and stunning, so it's not really that fun to play. It can be interesting if you actually get super invested and learn all of the little tricks and cancels that the game has to offer, but that was never really the appeal in the previous systems for me. I always liked combat in Resident Evil 4 and 5 because those games had simple systems, but those systems went incredibly far with one game mode: Mercenaries. It's about how we use the simple systems that were provided, making the most of what we have. Providing extra depth to this system just makes it feel like a different game, so it's not really all that enjoyable. But functionally, it's mostly the same as the previous action games in the series, but with a new gameplay control. Resident Evil 6 as a whole is basically a huge mess. It has so many problems that just add up to create this incredibly weird product that does not feel like a Resident Evil game at all. It feels more like a Marvel movie than it does a zombie horror tale. Resident Evil 6 was born with wax wings, destined to fly too close to the sun. From the moment that Resident Evil 4 succeeded as much as it did, it was written in stone that this game would be made, that Capcom would take things too far. This is because Resident Evil feels like it exists in cycles. The series invents or reinvents itself in ways that make it successful. This was seen with the original PS1 games and the initial success that the series had. Capcom attempts to recreate their original successes as many times as they can, and they milk the cow until it's dry, taking the original concept further and further until it stops working. Then, they need to reinvent the series, and luckily, they do this to great response, just like with Resident Evil 4. This series is successful again and critically acclaimed, but once again, they fall into the same trap. With Resident Evil 5 and 6, Capcom tried to recreate the success of Resident Evil 4. It worked with Resident Evil 5, but it wasn't as successful with Resident Evil 6. Shinji Mikami, though he was gone from the company at the time, had kind of called this one. He said that he wouldn't play Resident Evil 5 because he knew there were too many things he would have changed, and he warned the team that he thought they wouldn't be able to do another game in an action style with 6 because it might be stale. And by the time 6 came out, it was clear that Capcom had lost the plot. They had lost what originally made Resident Evil 4 so appealing in the first place, what made it a game that could last for decades rather than just a short sales quarter. This game's story drags on, and when it's bad, it's almost insufferably boring. It's hard to even continue on because there's nothing really keeping you there. Disconnected levels that almost have nothing to do with each other because the story isn't moving forward. When it's good, it's basically just a rehash of previous games or tropey stories that have already been told in other mediums 100 times over. The gameplay is frustrating and removes most of the fun from the franchise, along with the horror. This game is not scary at all, and even the most horror that it gets, Leon's campaign, doesn't feel like a horror game in the slightest. Resident Evil 6 released to quite a strong start, selling 4.5 million units and setting a new record for the company. But after the reception to the game was weak and reviews mostly came out mixed, the sales began to slow, causing Capcom to lower their financial projections for the year. Resident Evil 6 was a slight bump in the road for the series, but it was a clear indicator that the main numbered entries needed another big change to grab more interest in the franchise again. Capcom would do this to great success, but we'll talk about that next time. Bye, Dad. Thanks again for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, be sure to like it and subscribe to the channel. Go check out some of the other Resident Evil videos I have on my channel if you haven't already. You can also subscribe to my Patreon, where I'm currently reviewing every Resident Evil movie. And I just finished the Paul W.S. Anderson movies and am moving on to the Netflix era. I should have Resident Evil 7 and 8 out pretty soon, but first I'm going to take a detour to review Death Stranding 2 pretty in depth, so keep an eye out for that. Bye now.